Thank you. Thank you so much. I am so excited to be here tonight. My name is Richard Gage, AIA. I've been a practicing architect for 20 years, and I'm a member of the American Institute of Architects. I became interested in the World Trade Center high-rise collapses on 9/11 after hearing the startling conclusions of a reluctant 9/11 researcher, David Ray Griffin, on San Francisco Bay Area's KPFA radio, Guns and Butter, with Bonnie Faulkner in March of 2006. This has changed my life radically and launched my own personal and professional quest for 9/11 truth, inspiring me to found Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, which now numbers hundreds of architects and engineers who are demanding a real investigation into the destruction of these buildings. I'm employed with a San Francisco Bay Area architecture firm, which, by the way, has no affiliation with my work in 9/11. Like many other architects, though, I've designed numerous fireproof steel frame buildings in my career, including these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums and the day-to-day construction administration services for this $120 million high school in San Ramon, California. I'm now working on a $400 million project in Nevada with almost 2 million square feet of retail, parking structure, and fireproofed steel-framed mid-rise office space, with over 1,200 tons of steel framing altogether. I'd like to start by thanking each and every one of you for being willing to consider the very difficult subject of the destruction of the World Trade Center and its staggering loss of life on 9/11. Just as architecture and engineering projects are sometimes joyful, sometimes quite difficult, this particular project has proven to be extremely difficult. Not difficult in terms of reaching conclusions, but difficult in terms of the implications of those conclusions and finding people who are open-minded enough to be willing to hear the facts about these building collapses. Check out every fact that we point out, because it's extremely important that we know the whole truth about this event. After all, it served as the pretext for the invasion of 2 countries in which already over 1 million people have perished. Also, as the pretext for the loss of many of our own cherished liberties here at home in the United States through recent legislation such as the Patriot Act, the Military Commissions Act, and the forthcoming Senate Bill 1959, the Violent Radicalization and Homegrown Terrorism Act, in which many of us can be named a terrorist and have no right to an attorney or trial by jury. Another 9/11 could happen again if we don't dedicate ourselves to finding out exactly what happened and why, and to bringing those actually responsible to justice. What do I mean it could happen again? Well, basically, we're promised another 9/11 by members of the Congress, the media, and the Bush administration, with official statements such as this: the next attack will make September 11th pale by comparison. A nuclear weapon in the middle of one of our own cities. A nuclear terrorist attack on the U.S. could be imminent. Weapon of mass destruction this summer or early fall. It'll be much bigger than 9/11. And Michael Chertoff, a gut feeling that attacks were imminent last summer without any evidence or facts suggesting that. These are among the many reasons that we must peer into the painful part of our recent history and to re-examine the relatively new physical evidence from 9/11 which we have not seen in the mainstream media, and to find out why, for instance, a 2006 poll by the New York Times and CBS reveals that 28% of Americans believe that the Bush administration is lying, and not just about Iraq, but about the events of 9/11. And Time magazine reporting that 36% of Americans consider it likely or somewhat likely that government officials either allowed the attacks to be carried out or carried them out themselves. And an even more recent poll from Zogby in 2007, finding 51% of Americans want Congress to probe the president and the vice president about 9/11. Of even greater concern, another poll that year by Scripps Howard, Ohio University, which found that a shocking 16% of Americans believe that the World Trade Center Twin Towers were brought down by explosives. NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, claims they found no evidence for explosive demolition at the Twin Towers. Later, they admit that they never looked for it. How can you find what you are not looking for? Well, architects, engineers, scientists, and many others looked for it, and it was not hard to find. We've been speaking about it for 2 years now in over 36 cities, in a dozen states, and in Canada. We're proud to be a part of the international 9/11 Truth movement, which is growing by millions every year. We now have hundreds of architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth demanding a real investigation. This is our website. You can find on the right side the bullet points of information that we're going to be going through today. It's ae911truth.org. On the left side, you'll see the PowerPoint. You can step through it at your own pace because you may not have time to follow and read all the text and absorb the information that we're rapidly going to be going through. You can also watch the DVD on the left side, and you can purchase the DVD, of course, online. You can sign the petition after you find yourself convinced that this evidence is something worth looking at. Let's get something clear from the start. The ever-growing number of architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth are not conspiracy theorists. We're building and technical professionals looking at the science-based forensic evidence in the destruction of these high-rises on 9/11. As Joel Hirshhorn, PhD, says, first, let the technical truths emerge. Then, if necessary, cope with the inevitable conspiracy and other questions. Tonight, we're presenting to you the technical truths, the evidence found for the explosive demolition of all 3 World Trade Center high-rise collapses on 9/11, the iconic Twin Towers and the mysterious Building 7. 9/11. Just the utterance of it brings us right back to the terror-filled morning. We were subjected to these shocking attacks, killing thousands of Americans, destroying cultural icons. The 6 years has given us time to step back and examine these events more objectively, to step back from the shock-induced trance, really, to evaluate the relatively new evidence that's only come out in the last couple of years, and to re-examine these 3 high-rise collapses more objectively. Let's begin with an overview of the events of that morning in order to start us off on the same page, looking at the jets and the impacts and how this myth developed.
On September 11th, we learned that 4 passenger planes were hijacked and taken radically off course. Within an hour, 2 of the planes had flown into the enormous steel towers of the World Trade Center, creating fires and eventually toppling them. Dazed by the news, the American public soon believed the fires in the towers had burned so hot they caused the steel frames of the buildings to give way. A myth developed, fed by official sources through the media to a bewildered audience.
So when it was attacked again, he immediately...
Elements of the myth. The impact of the airplanes, gallons of burning jet fuel, steel melting, the buildings failing and suddenly imploding. In a mere 10 seconds, 110 stories hurtled earthward, pulverizing into dust.
We ran to the building and went into the...
Right from the start, on the street itself, the official story was born.
Come out of nowhere and just scream right into the side of the Twin Tower, exploding through the other side. And then I witnessed both towers collapse, one first and then the second, mostly due to structural failure because the fire was just too intense.
We need to look for these kinds of people and these kinds of events that are the first ones interviewed by mainstream media, planting the official story in the minds of people.
The myth bled into the FEMA report and was echoed by the experts.
It was the combination of the impact load doing great damage to the building, followed by the fire, that caused collapse.
Well, let's take a look at that. What we do is we apply the scientific method, which many of us learned in 7th and 8th grade. It's the best way yet discovered for winnowing truth from lies and delusion. The simple version looks something like this. We formulate a question. How did the Twin Towers collapse? We perform research. We make observations. We construct a hypothesis. We have an idea how it collapsed. It collapsed by fire. It collapsed by explosive controlled demolition. We make some predictions. And we test those predictions and those assumptions with experiments, objective, verifiable, repeatable experiments. We analyze the results and we draw conclusions. Now, if those conclusions are found to be corroborated by the evidence, we report it in an open, transparent manner where our experiments and our findings can be repeated. If it is not found to be corroborated, we think and try again and construct a new hypothesis with new observations, new research. Buildings are destroyed by a number of different forces, each of which have very different and identifiable characteristics. For instance, fires affect buildings quite differently than controlled demolitions. Fires, by their nature, tend to creep from place to place as they run out of fuel, moving to fresh new fuel sources, leaving the burned out area to cool. So when collapses do occur, and by the way, you'll note that they've never occurred in over 100 examples of very hot, very large, and very long-lasting fires, buildings tend to fall over. They fall asymmetrically. They're burned out on one side organically, if you will. It's a natural process. They don't fall straight down through the path of greatest resistance. Let's listen to Jonathan Barnett from FEMA talk about what fires are expected to do in steel buildings.
The way in which steel-framed buildings behave in fires depends on their construction. In this test, done by British Steel in 1995, a large amount of typical office furniture was burned to see what would happen to the heavy steel beams that supported the ceiling.
When steel is bare, when it heats up, it gets weaker. It's not that it melts in a fire. In fact, normal fires are not hot enough to melt steel. Even if you were, for example, to use an unusual fuel like kerosene, you cannot achieve temperatures hot enough to melt steel. But what happens is it starts to lose its strength. And as it loses its strength, it starts to sag. It becomes softer and sags and can no longer support the load.
This was the largest test of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted, even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In over 20 years, I have not seen, until recently, a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
So what was the cause of the devastating, explosive failure that happened to the World Trade Center?
These particular buildings collapsed. They follow the path of least resistance, or they fell over. You can see that the building structure holds the building together in some recognizable form. The structural elements have not been dismembered from each other, and their concrete is not pulverized to dust. They follow the path of least resistance, which is generally over. These buildings exploded. Witnesses hear sounds of explosions. They see flashes of light. There's thick, billowing, and enormous pyroclastic clouds of pulverized concrete. The expansion of the gases very quickly produces this cauliflower-like formation that we see in the smoke. This is a controlled demolition. Let's focus on this type of destruction first. We have hundreds of examples from all across the country from which to make our comparison because it's the most commonly used method to demolish high-rises. This is what a high-rise looks like when it's being demolished with explosives. Controlled demolitions can be engineered in many different ways. Normally, the purpose of a controlled demolition is to remove a structure while avoiding damage to adjacent structures, and to do so economically. Typically, a tall building like this is demolished by placing thousands of cutter charges throughout the columns and beams in the building and then detonating them in a very precise order, starting with the interior structures and then progressing outward, synchronistically timed floor by floor. Destroying the interior columns allows the unsupported weight to pull the exterior inward. Destroying the building from the ground up allows the weight of the building to be harnessed to do much of the destruction. So the result is an implosion, producing a vertical, symmetrical collapse at free fall speed into a consolidated rubble pile that's broken up and ready for loading and shipment. Now, this is a feat that only a handful of companies in the United States can accomplish. Let's take a look at some of the key characteristics of controlled demolition. First, we have a sudden onset of destruction at the base of the structure. We have straight down symmetrical collapse into its own footprint because demolition waves remove the column support, resulting in a free fall speed virtually through the path of what was the greatest resistance, thousands of tons of structural steel. We have a total dismemberment of the steel structure, so it's loaded and ready for shipment. We have minimal damage to adjacent structures, sounds and flashes of explosions heard and seen by witnesses, enormous clouds of pulverized concrete, squibs sometimes, explosive charges that go off at the wrong times, chemical evidence of cutter charges. These are all fairly typical, and they go to show us direct evidence of explosive destruction. Now, the interesting thing is that not one of these typical characteristics of controlled demolition can be explained or accounted for by fire, let alone all 10 of them. Typically, we'll have government documentation, expert corroboration, foreknowledge, and video documentation, all of which supports the hypothesis of controlled demolition, providing proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Let's take a look at World Trade Center 7 now. It was 47 stories tall, what would have been the tallest building in 33 of our states, half the height of the Twin Towers, dwarfed only by its proximity to what was, for a couple of years, the tallest buildings in the world. It was not hit by an airplane. It was the third World Trade Center high-rise to collapse on 9/11 at about 5:20 in the afternoon. World Trade Center 7 was hit by debris from the North Tower. You can see it being pelted here. And it sustained about 8 fires, according to NIST, on various floors. This is the World Trade Center 7, 47 stories high. Don't be confused by the shadow from this building. Here we have the 12th and 13th floor fires and the 7th floor fire on the north side of the building, the opposite side of the building that was being pelted by the North Tower. Curiously enough, the Securities and Exchange Commission was operating out of this floor, which lost thousands of files related to hundreds of cases it was actively pursuing against Wall Street companies like Enron and WorldCom. So we are looking for an investigation that goes well beyond the buildings, of course. Now let's take a look at the evidence of World Trade Center 7 and see how it stacks up against the typical features of a controlled demolition, starting with, is there a sudden onset of destruction? Let's listen to this emergency word.
We were watching the building actually because it was on fire. The bottom floors of the building were on fire, and we heard this sound that sounded like a clap of thunder. Turned around, we were shocked to see that the building was, it looked like there was a shock wave ripping through the building, and the windows all busted out, and it was horrifying. And then, about a second later, the bottom floor caves out, and the building followed after that, and we saw the building crash down all the way to the ground. We were in shock, and then
a sound of a clap of thunder, a shock wave ripping through the building, and windows busting out, and then the building coming down. Do we have a straight-down symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint? Let's listen to Dan Rather narrate this collapse for us as we take our first look at the collapse of Building 7.
And what you're seeing are high shots. Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself.
Describe that.
Now we go to videotape, the collapse of this building.
It's amazing.
Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
What, Dan? Deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down? Dan never repeated these words after this first day. In fact, we didn't see this building coming down after 9/11. Let's take a look from West Street. Maybe we haven't quite understood yet what's going on. Well, I'm not quite convinced yet. Let's take a look in this side-by-side comparison with a known controlled demolition on the right. Did the building fall into its own footprint? Pretty much so. A little bit of overlapping into the street. I could have done a much better job myself. A tidy rubble pile, nevertheless. Do we have demolition waves? And how do these remove the column support? Well, here's a floor plan of Building 7. Now, to bring a building smoothly, symmetrically into its own footprint without falling over, what we have to do is remove the core columns, because what we want to do is bring the outside of the building in on itself. Now, this involves a high degree of precision that fire is not capable of, being an organic process. We're told by NIST in a December 18th update meeting that we attended via telecon that there is virtually no influence in the collapse from the debris from the North Tower or the damage caused by it, or from the diesel that may have been spilling out of the diesel line. Why? Well, the east penthouse is the first part of the building to collapse a few seconds before the global collapse. And so NIST is now targeting column number 79. And so that is where they say the collapse initiated. Do we have a free fall speed of collapse through the path of greatest resistance? Let's listen to David Chandler.
We can measure the downward acceleration of Building 7 by video frame analysis. I used a magnifying glass to place markers on the corner of the building on each frame. From this we can get a data table and various graphs. The slope of this graph indicates acceleration, which is shown here to be about minus 10.279 plus or minus 0.6. Free fall in a vacuum is minus 9.8 in these units. That falls within the margin of error of this measurement. In other words, the rate of fall of Building 7 in the first few seconds is indistinguishable from free fall in a vacuum.
What are we talking about? You can see second by second the building gaining downward momentum. You can plot the drop distance on a graph of time, and it fits the free fall curve almost perfectly. What does this mean? That the columns had to have been removed, and removed virtually simultaneously on each floor, synchronistically timed, so the building had no resistance virtually on the way down. Do we have a total dismemberment of the steel structure? We had a 47-story skyscraper compressed to 4 stories. How does this happen? This building had some moment-resisting frames on several floors. That's where the beams are welded very rigidly to the columns. Do we have sounds of explosions, though? Here's Craig Bartmer from the New York Police Department.
And the whole time you hear thum, 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 thum. So, I think I know an explosion when I hear it. I was real close to Building 7 when it fell down. That didn't sound like just a building falling down to me while I was running away from it. There's a lot of eyewitness testimony down there hearing explosions. I didn't see any reason for that building to fall down the way it did, and a lot of guys should be saying the same thing.
How about Kevin McPadden, former Air Force Special Operations Search and Rescue?
He came back over with his hand over the radio, and it sounded like a countdown. And at the last few seconds, he took his hand off, and you heard 3, 2, 1, and he was just saying, "Just run for your life, just run for your life." And then it was like another 2, 3 seconds, you heard explosions, like ba-boom. It's like a distinct sound. It's not like when in compression, like boom, 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 like floors that were dropping and collapsing. This was ba-boom, and like you felt a rumble in the ground, like almost like you wanted to grab onto something. That, to me, I knew that was an explosion. There was no doubt in my mind.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. Do we have enormous clouds of pyroclastic smoke from the pulverized concrete? Watch the concrete entrained in the air racing down every street in each direction at 35 miles an hour. This incredible volume of pyroclastic dust enfolding itself. It takes incredible quantities of heat to create this kind of action. A lot more heat than the 8 various fires that were on these floors. Do we have pools of molten iron? Let's start with the South Tower now. This section applies to the World Trade Center Twin Towers and Building 7. We're told by NIST that this substance must be melted aluminum from the airplane. But melted aluminum looks like melted aluminum. It's silvery. It doesn't glow in daylight conditions. As of 21 days after the attack, the fires were still burning and molten steel was still running, says World Trade Center structural engineer Leslie Robertson to a conference of structural engineers on October 5th, 2001, 1 month after 9/11. Fires burned, molten metal flowed in the pile of ruins, still settling beneath my feet, says Sarah Atlas. Well, what do the first responders and the demolition contractors say about molten metal? Saw pools of literally molten steel. Molten metal beams had just been totally melted. It was dripping from the molten steel. Steel flowed in molten streams. They're finding molten steel, seeing the molten steel, uncovering red-hot metal beams. Molten metal, red-hot, weeks after the event. Molten steel at the heart of the tower's remains. Molten steel beams, streams of molten metal that leaked from the hot cores and flowed down the broken walls. Molten metal dripping from a beam. The end of the beam would be dripping with molten steel. And this structural engineer, Abu Hassan Astani from Berkeley, cites and documents, "I saw melting of girders in the World Trade Center. Still so hot that molten metal dripped down the side of the wall from Building 6. Debris past the columns was red hot, molten, running. A fire truck 10 feet below the ground that was still burning 2 weeks after the tower collapsed. Its metal so hot that it looked like a vat of molten steel. Pieces of steel, still cherry red."
One of the more unusual artifacts to emerge from the rubble is this rock-like object that has come to be known as the meteorite.
It's this fused element of steel, molten steel and concrete and all of these things all fused by the heat. And architects, engineers, people who work with steel, welders have just never seen the level of destruction and the level of deformation of this material in our lives.
These cooled meteorites are not aluminum because aluminum doesn't rust. So it's not a melted airplane. What does the gentleman in charge of the cleanup at World Trade Center Ground Zero have to say about the molten metal?
Mark Loiseau, the president of Controlled Demolition Incorporated, told the American Free Press that in the basements of the World Trade Center, where 47 central support columns connected to the bedrock, hot spots of literally molten steel were discovered more than a month after September 11th. These incredibly hot areas were found at the bottoms of the elevator shafts, down 7 basement levels. The molten steel was found 3, 4, and 5 weeks later when the rubble was being removed. He said that molten steel was also found at World Trade Center 7. The highest temperature was in the east corner of the South Tower, where a temperature of 1,377 degrees Fahrenheit was recorded. The molten steel in the basement was more than double that temperature.
What are we talking about here? Here is Building 7 at A and B, and here is the North Tower and the South Tower. These hot spots are 1,340 to 1,370 degrees. These are the temperatures of the hottest office fires. There was no fire on the surface of Ground Zero after the collapses. What are we measuring here? We're measuring the molten metal that was seen by these first responders 4, 5, 6 stories down below in the basements. That was surely at least twice or 3 times these temperatures. What's the problem with that? Office fires, Eager says 1,200 degrees. NIST claims 1,800 degrees, for which we have no evidence for office fires of that temperature in the Trade Center towers. Well, when something's salmon or lemon colored, it's 1,500 or 1,800 degrees. And structural steel doesn't even begin to melt until 2,700 or so degrees. We're missing 1,000 to 2,000 degrees of temperature, heat energy required to produce this stuff. Where is it coming from? We'll be taking a look at a possible suspect, thermite, which reaches temperatures of 4,500 degrees. Molten metal flowing off the substance held in the jaws of this backhoe. Now, let's listen to John Gross, lead engineer of NIST, tell us about the molten metal from his perspective.
I'm curious about the pool of molten steel that was found in the bottom of the towers.
I am too.
And
Please tell me about it. Have you seen it?
Well, not personally, but eyewitnesses there found huge pools of molten steel beneath the towers, and some scientists don't think that the collapse of the building could have melted all that steel. And physics professor analyzed some of the steel, and Stephen Jones, and he found evidence of thermate residue, which would explain how the buildings collapsed by means of pre-planted explosives. So, have you analyzed the steel for any of those residues?
First of all, let's go back to your basic premise that there was a pool of molten steel. I know of absolutely nobody, and no eyewitness who said so, nobody who's produced it.
You'd get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails. Like you're in a foundry.
Yeah, like lava.
Like it was lava
from a volcano.
Out still on the rubble, it's still, I believe, 1,100 degrees. The guy's boots just melt within a few hours.
This is how it's been since day one. Oh, it's unbelievable. And this is 6 weeks later, almost 6 weeks later. And as we get closer to the center of this, it gets hotter and hotter. It's probably 1,500 degrees. We've had some small windows into what we thought was a core at some point, and it looked like an oven. You know, it was just roaring inside. And it was just a bright reddish-orange color.
Underground, it was still so hot that molten metal dripped down the sides of a wall from Building 6.
I know of absolutely nobody, and no eyewitness who said so, nobody who's produced it.
What is the problem here? We have plenty of eyewitnesses who have produced it. Somebody's lying. I'm going to leave it up to you to make your own conclusions. The last fire was not even extinguished for 3 months after 9/11. Tom Manley says you couldn't even begin to imagine how much water was pumped in there. It was like you were creating a giant lake. Well, thermite contains its own source of oxygen. It burns just as well underwater. How about chemical evidence, though? What produced all this molten metal? And what is thermite anyway?
Thermite. An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
NFPA 921 is the guide for fire and explosion investigations. Was it used? They say unusual residues could arise from thermite, magnesium, or other pyrotechnic materials. In a crime scene, which this was an example of, did NIST use the guide? No. They acknowledged they didn't even look for such evidence. But others did. Dr. Stephen Jones performed chemical analysis on the previously molten metal. He does some background research, again part of the scientific method. Thermite would create a characteristic burn pattern with a white ash, a white-yellow hot liquid metal, an intense white reaction zone seen. It would also leave behind chemical evidence. Common elements such as iron, aluminum, copper, calcium, silicon. Unusual elements such as fluorine and manganese left behind also in the residue. These elements here. He sent a sample from this 40-pound chunk of previously molten metal from one of those meteorites. He finds that it's predominantly iron, so we can rule out aluminum from the jet plane. It has small amounts of aluminum, sulfur, and potassium, and manganese and fluorine in abundance. Manganese is from the potassium permanganate, commonly used as an oxidizer in thermite. Fluorine is also used in sol gel type thermite charges. So these appear to be the thermite fingerprint. Let's take a look at what else Dr. Jones found in the slag from the end of this memorial at Clarkston University. He performs his X-ray fluorescence on this small piece of slag and finds, once again, iron, sulfur, potassium, manganese, calcium. Gel explosives are all a super thermite, tiny aluminum particles in iron oxide in this sol gel. They can be cast into shape. They're like a clay. Lawrence Livermore Lab did research on this, and this invention offers a thermite-based apparatus for cutting target materials. You pack the thermite in here, and you ignite it, and it comes out and is forced through melting the structural steel element in fractions of a second, almost as effective as high-energy explosives, RDX and C4, which are more common in classic controlled demolitions. If sol gels were used, they would leave behind a very unique signature, 1,3-diphenyl propane. And in fact, EPA finds one molecule in their toxicological studies at levels that dwarfed all others, 1,3-diphenyl propane. Eric Schwartz says we've never observed it in any other sampling we've ever done. But is there evidence of thermite in the World Trade Center dust? Dr. Jones received no less than 4 separate samples of World Trade Center dust, some of it from an apartment across the street, Jeanette McKinley's apartment, where the windows blew in and filled her apartment with a foot of this dust. Another sample was found like 10 minutes later on the Brooklyn Bridge, Well, he takes this and he puts a magnet over it, and he finds that there are small particles that come up to the magnet. Some of them are angular, some of them are round. They look like this. In fact, he calculates by the weight of the amount of these spheres that he finds in the dust that there must have been about 10 tons for all of the dust that was available. They're about a 1/16 of an inch in diameter, the largest ones, and most of them, though, are smaller than a human hair. What could produce such an incredible array of microspheres? Well, if you had thousands of cutter charges going off in the columns and beams throughout the building, and they were under this incredible pressure, what you'd see is something like this. Tens of thousands or millions of tiny droplets. What's the shape of those droplets? When a liquid is dispersed like this, its surface tension forms itself into almost a perfect sphere. In the case of molten iron, those droplets cool and they fall along with the dust everywhere. He compares the spheres to a known thermite experiment performed by John Peroulis in Nevada, which finds the same spheres. In fact, we do another XEDS, and we find in the microspheres the same kinds of evidence. We have iron, manganese, and in the case of this known thermite signature, it matches basically. In other words, we have a controlled experiment to compare the results against. And for those who know how to read these graphs, such as Dr. Jones and others, this is pretty much of a direct match indicating that this is the signature of thermite. Dr. Jones is not the only one who finds these iron-rich microspheres. The EPA finds them in all the dust and the toxicological studies they're doing. They have no idea where they came from. They don't report the results other than just a tiny bit. They're curious. They sweep it under the rug. It has only one possible formation, and that is from liquid molten iron under extreme pressure. R.J. Lee finds the iron-rich microspheres on top of the Deutsche Bank building in their toxicological studies. Is this what corroded the tops of these cars? This atomized thermite cooling. Manganese was also found in large proportions, very toxic stuff from the city's chief medical examiner. Very, very concerned about it. Well, Dr. Jones concludes that given the mix of trace metals present in these high concentrations in the dust, such as zinc, copper, manganese, and the formation of iron-rich aluminum spheres, it's clear that significant aluminothermic reactions occur, and he can reverse engineer this and suggest to us that there must have been in the thermite mix powders of aluminum, iron oxide, copper oxide, zinc nitrate, and potassium permanganate. Well, would there possibly be any unignited thermite pieces in the World Trade Center dust? Indeed, he finds it. It also comes up to the magnet from his dust samples. Many chips. This one, a 1/16 of an inch long, red on one side, gray on the other. The red side is composed of tiny iron oxide particles and aluminum. In fact, he does an XEDS on this stuff too, and he finds a little bit of sulfur, more aluminum, lots of iron, and manganese. And compare that to the traditional thermite, it's also a match for unignited thermite. This stuff is not made in a cave in Afghanistan. The Lawrence Livermore Lab came out with papers only a year or two ago about this stuff. The particles being so small allow for almost instantaneous ignition between the two chemicals, the aluminum and the iron oxide, producing very explosive results. Los Alamos Lab and Lawrence Livermore Lab have produced these results. Then he continues his study and finds additional chips that are partially ignited, with spheres embedded in them, indicating that the source of the spheres is, for all intents and purposes, identified very clearly here. Partially reacted thermite. These results are documented in a peer-reviewed journal, in the Open Civil Engineering Journal. Volume 2. 14 points of agreement, he calls it, with official government reports on the World Trade Center destruction, because it turns out that there is much in common between the NIST report, the FEMA report, and the work that we are doing. And of course, there's much disagreement as well. But Dr. Jones is an optimist. So we're going to look for the points of agreement. He's also documented this in Applying the Scientific Method, which is on our website, ae911truth.org, also on journalof911studies.com. With Dr. Jones and his small team of scientists, through EDS, XRF, and WDS, identifies the components of these spheres and chips, predominantly iron, along with aluminum, oxygen, silicon, 1,3-diphenylpropane. The results, coupled with the visual evidence, he says, at the scene, such as the flowing hot liquid metal, providing compelling evidence that thermite reaction compounds were deliberately placed in both World Trade Center towers and Building 7. Verify the results, please. This must be repeatable. There's lots of dust out there. We encourage everyone who has any samples of this dust to email us at ae911truth.org so that we can get repeatable samplings done. We need a lot of this. Now, all of this is direct evidence of explosive destruction in Building 7. We'll jump back to only Building 7 now. Now, none of these characteristics can be explained by fire, let alone all of them. Why? Well, buildings are protected from fire. High-rise steel frame buildings in particular have 2- and 3-hour fire protection designed to allow the occupants to escape a fire. But even after, in fires that are much longer than 2 hours, larger, these buildings have not collapsed. Why? Let's take a look. Here's New York, 1970, burned 6 hours over 5 floors. Los Angeles, 3.5 hours over 5 floors. Philadelphia, 18 hours over 8 floors. Caracas, Venezuela, burned 17 hours over 26 floors. Not one of these fires brought these high-rises down. In fact, no steel frame high-rise building has ever been brought down by any fire. Yet relatively small and randomly placed fires and a whole lot of smoke is to have brought this skyscraper, Building 7, down in 6.5 seconds after burning in just that afternoon. How about that FEMA report and these investigations? Well, we had 4 investigations starting in 2001 with the ASCE, American Society of Civil Engineers. We're told these are volunteers, but these are not your average PTA volunteers. These guys earn $10 million annually average between them, working for the Defense Department and with their expertise mainly on blast resistance of buildings. Then we have the FEMA report in 2002. Which finally got some funding, $600,000. Compare that to the $40 million effort to find out the source of those stains on Monica Lewinsky's dress. This is easily the 3rd worst structural failure in modern history. It deserves a far greater response and resources. In 2002, we had the Silverstein-Weidlinger report, responsible for reversing the theory of FEMA, which came up basically with the pancake theory, or the zipper theory, where one truss pulled away from the columns and then caused the others to pull away, and that chain reaction went around, and then the floors pancaked all the way down. We'll talk about that. Silverstein-Weidlinger report was responsible for changing that theory, because if that were true, it would have been the bolts that broke, and therefore Larry Silverstein, the overall owner of this complex, would not have been paid his $5.6 billion that he's been paid on the insurance settlement. Why? Because that would have been the building's fault instead of the terrorist's fault. So we had to have another theory. And the new theory states that the trusses sagged, pulled in the columns, they blamed the persistence of that connection, and then the columns buckled, and then the whole thing came down. Either way, it's something that we're going to be looking at very, very critically here in a moment. Then we have the NIST investigation, which took over all of these investigations in 2005 and came up with a 3-year, $20 million effort. We'll take a close look at NIST's work. these experts who worked on these buildings all worked from the FEMA report, or most of them, into the Weidlinger report and into the NIST report. These are not independent investigation by any means whatsoever. Let's listen to what FEMA did conclude, because it is interesting. Evidence of a severe high-temperature corrosion attack on the steel, including rapid oxidation, sulfidation, and subsequent intergranular melting. Very interesting. Remember, office fires don't melt steel. What melted this steel? Sulfur formed during this hot corrosion attack on the steel. Here is the intergranular melting documented for all of us. Thank you. Capable of turning a solid steel girder into Swiss cheese, like this former column, wide flange column from the structural steel in Building 7. Now they document this very carefully in their Appendix C. Listen to this. Gaping holes, some larger than a silver dollar, let light shine through. A 1-inch column being reduced to half-inch thickness, its edges curled like a paper scroll, having been thinned to almost razor sharpness. This was the flange, curled up on itself. This is the web of that wide flange column. NIST swept this entire Appendix C under the rug, and we do not have it in the official report today. Listen to this, though. The collapse of World Trade Center 7 had a small debris field as the facade was pulled downward, suggesting internal failure and implosion. The specifics of the fires in World Trade Center 7 and how they caused the building to collapse remain unknown at this time. What? Unknown? The best hypothesis, fire plus random damage, and then complete collapse, has only a low probability of occurrence. Wait a minute. You spent $600,000 of our taxpayer money and over a year investigating this, and it has your best hypothesis isn't even right? What do you do when your hypothesis is not corroborated by the facts? You go back and you construct a new hypothesis. In FEMA's case, punt. And that's what they did. They say further research, investigation, and analysis are needed to resolve this issue. But unfortunately, for those hoping to resolve the issue, much of that evidence had already been destroyed, about 99% of it, in fact, by FEMA, before the report came out in May of 2002. Let's listen to what real investigation should have been performed.
Normally, when you have a structural failure, you carefully go through the debris field, looking at each item, photographing every beam as it collapsed and every column where it is in the ground, and you pick them up very carefully and you look at each element. We were unable to do that in the case of Tower 7.
Why? Because all the steel was removed before the report came out. In fact, 800 truckloads a day. Easily the three worst structural failures in modern history. 250 pieces were saved. Crucial evidence that could answer the questions is on the slow boat to China, exclaims Bill Manning, editor-in-chief of the 125-year-old Fire Engineering magazine that brings together fire protection engineers to communicate with each other, showing an astounding ignorance of the government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately. Commission a fully resourced blue ribbon panel to conduct a clean and thorough investigation is what they were calling for. If the evidence contradicts your fire hypothesis, destroy it. That's where our tax dollars are going. How about the 9/11 Commission, which was tasked with giving us the fullest explanation? No. Not one sentence in the 571 pages of the 9/11 Commission report even mentions the destruction of World Trade Center 7. Is this one of the reasons, perhaps, that Senator Max Cleland resigns from the commission, citing it's a national scandal? The investigation is compromised. How about expert corroboration? How about Danny Jawenko, 27-year controlled demolitions expert? It starts from below. They've simply blown away the columns. It's controlled demolition. A team of experts did this. It's professional work, without a doubt. How about Hugo Bachmann, Professor Emeritus, Chairman, Department of Structural Dynamics at Earthquake Engineering, Swiss Federal Institute of Technology? In my opinion, the building, World Trade Center 7, was with great probability professionally demolished. How about Kamal Obeid with Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, a structural engineer? A localized failure in a steel frame building like World Trade Center 7 cannot cause a catastrophic collapse like a house of cards without a simultaneous and patterned loss of several of its columns at key locations within the building. Does that sound like fire? No. How about this forensic fire protection engineer, once again, Jonathan Barnett?
We were surprised that Tower 7 collapsed, we being the team that investigated what occurred on that day.
Building 7, do we have any foreknowledge of its destruction? We're moving the command post over this way. That building's coming down, says Chief Nick Viscani. Well, there was some structural damage, as we've noted, and they were concerned about it. By noon or 1 o'clock, they told us we had to move from the triage site up to Pace University, a little further away, because Building 7 was going to come down or being brought down, says Indira Singh, interviewed by Bonnie Faulkner on KPFA. Did they actually use the words brought down? Yeah, that's what they said. We're going to have to bring it down. This involves volition. Listen to these construction workers walking away from Building 7, and this police officer caught on CNN camera.
Keep your eye on that building. It'll be coming down.
Building is about to blow up. Move it back.
All right, guys.
We are walking back. There's a building about to blow up. On flame. Debris coming down.
Keep your eye on that building. It's about to come down. The building is about to blow up. Flame and debris coming down. How do they know? And how about Kevin McPadden? What did he say?
And at the last few seconds, he took his hand off, and you heard 3, 2, 1.
Countdown? Does that imply foreknowledge? Do fires bring buildings down to countdowns? Unlikely. In fact, the BBC announces the collapse 20 minutes before it happened. It's true. Jane Stanley is here announcing it. She says the 47-story Solomon Brothers building close to the World Trade Center has also collapsed. And there it is standing behind her. The BBC apologizes for this grievous error, citing the confusing events of the day. But does that make them psychic? Unlikely. Is there some kind of script that's handed out, like the guy on the street, the Twin Towers, who had all the answers? I believe we've shown that Building 7 matches all of the features of controlled demolition in the classic sense. Is it likely that Al-Qaeda could have had access to this building, which had to have been one of the most secure outside the Pentagon? We have to ask ourselves that question a few times, because if they didn't, then who did? This is as far as we go. You need to go farther, and there are resources at your disposal to do just that. I will point them out after we look at the World Trade Center Twin Towers, because as clear as the evidence is for the destruction of Building 7 by explosives, the evidence is even more clear in the case of the Twin Towers. When you look at it with a new pair of glasses and looking at the forensic science-based evidence. Let's get introduced here. Some called it the crowning achievement of the international style, this pair of buildings. Others, heartless modernism. In fact, architect Robert Stern calls it gigantic dumbness, right? It's two squares extruded just to the point where they become the highest buildings in the world. Well, either way, no matter how you feel about these buildings, they did have innovative structural engineering led by John Skilling and his aide, Leslie Robertson, who helped Minoru Yamasaki preserve the simple sculptural purity of his forms. And you can compare this building to the elegant Art Deco of the Empire State Building and come to your own conclusions about design. But it did eclipse the highest building in the world in 1976, but just for a couple of years until the Sears Tower outgrew it. The structural engineering innovations were quite extraordinary, lending the award, the engineering project that demonstrates the greatest engineering skills and represents the greatest contribution to engineering progress and mankind by the American Society of Civil Engineers. Let's take a look at what we achieved. We have 60-foot spans. We have a perimeter structure, which is like a tube structure, and this inner core. Let's take a look at it. Most high-rises up to this time were built on a dense grid of steel or concrete frames all the way throughout the building in a 20 or 30-foot grid. The Twin Towers were built as a tube structure with a very dense, strong mesh of steel surrounding the exterior and acting as a bearing wall, which resists the lateral loads, earthquake, and in the case of this building, particularly wind. Hurricanes up to 140 miles an hour it was designed to resist. This perimeter structure was 14-inch columns, 3 foot 9 inches on center. Inside was this core, a dense grid of 47 immense box columns, 4-inch thick at the base, 2-inch thick at mid-height. Prefabricated floor assemblies with 22-gauge steel decking, over which was poured reinforced concrete and held up by 29-inch deep open-web steel trusses. All of this, by the way, was completely pulverized on this floor structure on 9/11. We'll take a look at that. Now, these trusses were bolted to the perimeter columns and the core columns with these 5/8-inch bolts, which we talked about the different theories about what happened to those bolts. Now, this is a structure within a structure. This dense core structure would have remained standing 1,300 feet in the air if this surrounding, less strong floor structure were to have collapsed around it. In fact, the perimeter structure probably would have been left standing for a while until its lack of support gave in. This is the core columns, 52 inches by 22 inches along the long edge, almost solid steel at the bottom, continuously welded from the bottom all the way to the top. Now, any 1,800-degree fire would have been almost immediately conducted throughout this 100,000-ton heat sink. That's the reason there's been no collapse of steel frame high-rise fires, because of this steel. Hold a spoon over the stove. See how long you can hang on to it. Almost instantly, you'll be forced to let it go. Let's take a look at the structural imperative that was given to John Skilling.
John Skilling and Les Robertson were the structural engineers who designed the streamlined steel frames of the Twin Towers in the 1960s. Because a wayward Army bomber flew into the Empire State Building in 1945, the towers were built with skyscraper crashes in mind.
We had designed the project for the impact of our largest airplane of its time, the Boeing 707. That is to take this jet airplane, run it into the building, destroy a lot of structure, and still have it stand up.
The building was designed to have a fully loaded 707 crash into it. That was the largest plane at the time. I believe that the building probably could sustain multiple impacts of jetliners because this structure is like the mosquito netting on your screen door, this intense grid, and the jet plane is just a pencil puncturing that screen netting. It really does nothing to the screen netting.
A very robust structure, in fact. The forces coming down routed themselves around. They arched around the opening created by the airplane. In fact, Iger says the towers withstood the initial impact of the aircraft. This ability to withstand the initial impact is hardly surprising, given the robust nature. Now, we have the North Tower being hit at 8:46 in the morning, and about 102 minutes later, after fires traveled around the floors and up the floors in the case of the North Tower, the building did collapse. The South Tower was hit about 15 minutes later, and after only about 56 minutes, it collapses, as the fires were in fact diminishing severely. Skilling noted that he designed the towers to take a hit from a Boeing 707 traveling 600 miles an hour. When he was asked if he considered plane crashes, he cites, "Our analysis indicated the biggest problem would be the fact that all the fuel would dump into the building, but the building structure would still be there." This is FEMA's theory. We have the sagging of the trusses and the pulling away from the column, and then the subsequent pancaking down. Again, the trusses, one after the other, 6 foot 8 inches, every truss disengaging from the perimeter wall, which would have to be, at the rate that these buildings fell, that would have been at the speed of sound, the disengagement from one truss to the next, all the way around the building, and then the next floor and the next floor and the next floor. So NIST turns it around and blames the persistence of these connections pulling in the columns, causing the columns to buckle. Now, it's generally more difficult for people to understand that the towers were a controlled demolition because it was so outside of our frame of reference. We'd never seen anything like this. So this, combined with the shock, kept us from being objective. But if you were to plan a fire-induced collapse as a result of airplanes, you'd start the explosions at the point of jet plane impacts. So in World Trade Center 2 and 1, we have all of the key characteristic features of controlled demolitions, but with some of these key differences. We have a beginning of detonation at the point of jet plane impacts, not at the base of the building. In addition, we have not an implosion, but where everything is being exploded outside the footprint. We have squibs, or these mistimed explosions, that occur 20, 40, and even 60 stories down below. And as we already discussed the evidence for thermite in the molten metal and in the dust in the iron-rich microspheres. So let's take a look, starting with the sudden onset. And what is the evidence for this, and how is it produced? Produced by these sounds and flashes from the explosions. Now, the city's fire commissioner, Thomas von Essen, requires all of his EMTs and firefighters to record their experiences, about 500 of them, and in 12,000 pages, as it turns out, collected from 2001 to 2002. The New York State Court of Appeals overturns the city's request to hold on to this information against the lawsuit by the New York Times. They failed, and why was the city holding on to this information? Was it because 118 of these firefighters witnessed sounds and flashes of explosions? We felt the ground shake. You could see the tower sway, and then it just came down. All of a sudden, the ground just started shaking. It shook my bones. Shortly before the first tower came down, I remember feeling the ground shaking. Somewhere around the middle of the World Trade Center, there was this orange and red flash coming out. Initially, just one flash. Then it just kept popping all the way around the building. The building had started to explode. It's like on television, they blow up these buildings. Seemed like it was going all the way around, like a belt. All these explosions. Pop, pop, pop. That's when I heard the building coming down. Saw a brief number of light sources being emitted from inside the building between floors 10 and 15. I saw low-level flashes. We actually heard the pops. You know, you heard the pops of the building. It was blowing out on all four sides. With each popping sound, it was initially an orange, and then a red flash came out of the building. Then it would just go around the building on both sides. I saw a flash, 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 and then it looked like the building came down. I thought the terrorists planted explosives somewhere in the building. That's how loud it was, a crackling explosive. Well, you can hear that explosive in this video.
Yeah, here's one of the guys who can tell you I'm okay, all right? Here, hold on. You want to call your mother or something?
Does that sound like a fire or collapsing floors? None of these explosions are a part of the official story. Another loud boom at the upper floors, and then there was a series of smaller explosions which appeared to go completely around the building at the upper floors. Before it came down, I saw low-level flashes. Flash, 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 and then it looked like the building came down. Did you see any flashes? I said, yeah. I thought it was just me. He said, no, I saw them too. What did these guys experience?
We started running, floor by floor, instead of popping out.
It was if they had detonated. They were planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
All the way down.
How about the news reporters? What do they say? They tend to tell the truth, as we pointed out earlier, on the first day, and then we don't hear that truth again. What happens to it?
Anybody who's ever watched a building being demolished on purpose knows that if you're going to do this, you have to get at the under infrastructure of a building and bring it down.
The entire building has just collapsed, as if a demolition team set off. When you see the old demolitions of these old buildings, it folded down on itself, and it is not there anymore.
At 10:30, I tried to leave the building, but as soon as I got outside, I heard a second explosion and another rumble and more smoke and more dust. I ran inside the buildings, the chandelier shook, and again, black smoke filled the air. Within another 5 minutes, we were covered again with more silt and more dust. And then a fire marshal came in and said we had to leave because if there was a third explosion, this building might not last.
A huge explosion now raining debris on all of us. We better get out of the way.
And all of a sudden, it was this big explosion. I don't know if it's just like what you just seen. That's what we went through before we came out of the building.
There was another big explosion in the other tower.
Now watch this gentleman as he experiences the North Tower collapsing, and ask yourself this question: is his reaction justified by witnessing what we're told is a gravitational collapse, which happens to be about 1,700 feet away from him?
People were just standing around, talking to each other, nodding their heads. Oh my God.
Do you know if it was an explosion or if it was a building collapse?
To me, it sounded like an explosion,
but it was a huge explosion.
Chief Albert Turry told me that he was here after the events that took place this morning. He tried to get his men out as quickly as he could, but he said that there was another explosion which took place, and then an hour after, there was another explosion in one of the towers here. So according to his theory, he thinks that there were actually devices that were planted in the building.
It just went ba-boom. It was like a bomb went off. It was like holy hell coming down them stairs. And then when finally got to the bottom, they were coming out on the mezzanine level there, and another explosion came right from it, just everyone flying.
Like, it sounded like gunfire, bang, 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 and then all of a sudden, 3 big explosions.
I was about 5 blocks away when I heard explosions, 3 thuds, and turned around to see the building we just got out of, antenna tip over and fall in on itself.
We've heard reports of secondary explosions after the aircraft impacted, whether in fact there wasn't something else at the base of the towers that in fact were the coup de grace to bring them to the ground.
As we were getting our gear on and making our way to the stairway, there was a heavy-duty explosion.
Again, none of these explosions are a part of the official story. Now, compare these explosions to a known explosion on the left here. Outward arching streamers, pyroclastic volumes of dust, symmetrical display like a mushroom. Does it look like a gravitational collapse to you? How could explosives be placed in the World Trade Center Twin Towers with 50,000 occupants not knowing about it? Well, this is the floor plan. Let's enlarge it and take a close look. We note that the core structure, the columns of which are immediately adjacent to almost all of the elevators at the lower levels, certainly. If you had access to the elevator hoistway and you could hack through the 2 layers of 3/4-inch gypsum board protecting the building from a fire rising up through it, you would have access to the core columns and beams, and no one would see you. How about an elevator modernization, which we know was going on the 9 months prior to 9/11? Yes, Elevator World, March 2001, documents it. In fact, they were in the middle of this modernization. Ace Elevator had the contract. We're not conspiracy theorists, but it's pretty obvious that somebody needs to be asked some very key questions. There are people who noted that the elevators were locked in turn and that there were guards placed at these locked elevators during the modernization. Of course, you would have to have access to security. Securicom was brought in. Who sits on the board of Securicom? Marvin Bush, the younger brother of George Bush. Let's have somebody ask them some questions. Wireless detonation is common in the industry. You don't need miles of wire, and you can detonate them remotely with great flexibility, in fact. Well, but is there a precedent? And this tells us that it couldn't have been a controlled demolition because it didn't start at the bottom, right? That's where most controlled demolitions start with buildings. Let's take a look and see if there's another way to do it.
The words of a senior blaster.
We blow the basement, all the columns in the basement. Then we crack it up at the top to get it started. We go every other floor all the way down. Every explosive has a timer on it. That's why it's controlled. When the columns go, each floor goes down and impacts the one below and keeps going.
Mark Loiseau is president of a company called Controlled Demolition.
You don't have to go to the top floor. You can go almost anywhere in the structure, and given the right circumstances, you can release all of that stored energy, converting it into what is called kinetic energy. That's energy in motion, and that's what brings the building down.
Well, here's a 3-story top-down controlled demolition. Let's count them. 1, 2, 3. Now, these are high-energy explosives, C4 and RDX, very loud booms and very visible flashes. Perhaps the reason thermite was used is because they don't have as loud of these explosions like these high-energy explosives. And they don't have the flashes that these do either. Here's a 20-story middle-down controlled demolition. You can start demolitions from wherever you would like. Let's look at the North Tower now. What I want to point out to you is that you're going to see some explosions up at the top of the building, curiously enough. And what's going to happen is this entire section is going to telescope such that half of it, its upper half, is destroyed before there's any movement from the jet plane impacts down. Let's take a look. Here's the first evidence of explosion, and then over here, and then the collapsing. Of course, the violent clouds which are emerging even prior to the collapse. We're going to take a close-up look after this second look. A new fuel source, which very well might be jet fuel that wasn't burned, it's getting new oxygen. Let's take a look now closer up. Right away, we're seeing clouds forming up here. Well, wait, the collapse is supposed to be just down here. But we have asymmetrical damage to this building, right? The plane went in one side, and yet this complete symmetrical collapse, we'll use in quotes from now on, and let's keep going.
Unexpected to
And one
many
more
of us
time.
in terms of how swiftly
Belts, just like the firemen saw, all the way around the building.
they came down.
The antenna falls about 12
was
meters
unexpected to many of
first,
us in terms of
before
how
anything
swiftly it
else falls, indicating core column damage first, not trusses pulling away from the perimeter columns. Now take a look at this from the same tower from the bottom, noting the violence underneath the mushroom cloud. The collapse is supposed to be occurring way up here, but down below, as you'll see in this second run, incredible quantities of squibs, explosions bursting out. And on the third time, I'd like to direct your attention to this racing series of explosions down the right side in the corner of this building. About 40 stories below the collapsing building. It gets painfully obvious after a while, doesn't it?
The entire building has just collapsed as if a demolition team set off. When you see the
Note these multiple nodes of these independent explosions.
old demolition,
It's a little different than the North
these
Tower,
old buildings, it folded down on
but it's still incredibly
and it
the
is not
same
there anymore.
after a while, after all of these explosions developed. Do we have a straight-down symmetrical progression of collapse outside the footprint? We had a 207-foot wide building. FEMA tells us, and you can see in this document, that we have a 1,200-foot debris field, equidistant around each tower. Asymmetrical damage, symmetrical distribution, all through the site, in fact, and beyond. Do we have squibs, or these mistimed explosions? Some believe that these might be appropriately timed explosions. Whatever.
In all the videos of the collapses, explosions can be seen bursting from the building 20 to 30 stories below the demolition wave. Here, 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 and here.
Now, NIST tells us that these are puffs of air being produced by the collapsing building pushing air down the hoistway like a piston. It's got to come out somewhere, right? Well, first of all, these are not puffs of air. They're pulverized building materials. And they occur at 160 to 200 feet, some of them, per second. These velocities are propelled by explosives. 20, 40, and 60 stories below. How can the piston be producing all of that? And in fact, there are these focalized ejections that occur halfway between the corners of the building. Also, if say this was the open office space, right, 60 feet long, the elevator hoistway's over here, the piston's going to shove the air into this room. It's going to fill the room fairly uniformly with air pressure before it breaks any windows, right? And then it might break several, but not these highly focalized, pinpoint accurate, geometrically precise, violent ejections. No, it's extremely unlikely. But let's look at a couple of them here.
As the south tower begins to explode, we track two squibs near the bottom of the frame. They shoot out quickly at first, then slow and merge in with the rest of the dust cloud. Using the first few data points, we see the first squib shoots out at 44.98 meters per second, or about 100 miles per hour. Doing the same for the second squib, we get a speed of 56.3 meters per second, which works out closer to 126 miles per hour.
126 miles per hour of almost instant ejection velocity? Does fire create that? Do we have a near free fall pace through the path of greatest resistance? Let's take a look.
Galileo's law of falling bodies calculates the time in which an object will travel a certain distance in complete freefall. Distance, d, equals 16.8 times time in seconds squared. The South Tower was 1,362 feet tall. 1362 equals 16.08 times 84.7, or 9.2 seconds. The Twin Towers came down in nearly free fall speed.
What are we talking about here? Let's just try to put this in perspective with this story problem. We have a 15-story building which we hold with this crane over 95 stories of nothing but air. No resistance, right? Just air resistance. Next to it, another 15-story building held over a 95-story building with, say, 80,000 tons of structural steel in it. Now we're going to pull the lever on these cranes and drop them both at once. I brought a 95-story building with me today. And we're going to just test this theory of NIST's. I've got two 15-story buildings. We've got 80,000 tons of structural steel in this one right here. And we got air resistance here. So let's try it, okay? We'll put them both up here. We'll even give a little bit of impact load too, okay? Ready? 3, 2, 1. Oh my God, the one without any resistance under it hit the ground first at virtually free fall speed. This doesn't take much does it? What happened over here? The building above it met resistance. Through the energy of deformation, it came to a halt. In fact, you'll find on our website, ae911truth.org, that Ken Cutler and Gordon Ross produced these papers, and they show and calculate that, in fact, the building's downward momentum would have been almost immediately arrested. That where is the 15-story building that was driving this building down to the ground at free fall speed? In the first 2 seconds, you saw it reduce half of its mass. It was blown outside. It couldn't have been used to influence the downward progression of the building. In the next 2 seconds, after 4 seconds totally, it's destroyed itself. There's nothing crushing the building. It's tearing itself apart at free fall speed. And it's dismembering the steel structure. In fact, the leading edge of these mushroom clouds are full of perimeter columns, aluminum cladding, and other steel. Let's take a look at the South Tower in terms of dismemberment. See what's going on here. South Tower's on your left. It was hit lower by the aircraft, and as you can see, its descent starts, its rapid destruction starts there, and it begins to tilt to the left. Now, in fact, and it disappears into this cloud. We would expect to see this building, which is already tilted at 22 degrees and continuing its angular momentum, off-center of the building below it. How can it crush it symmetrically at free fall speed when it's already off-center? And we don't see it either mangled up in some heap at the bottom down on the pavement. It's been completely dismembered. Let's take a look from below, though, because I'm not quite convinced. We have asymmetrical damage, and yet there's this symmetrical destruction occurring underneath the cloud all the way around the building like the firemen saw, even though this top mass has already fallen over. Free fall speed. Doesn't make sense to me. Steel frame structure was completely dismembered. There are no large chunks of building, only those shards that we saw of the perimeter structure. Does it look like a gravitational collapse to you? Do we have a lateral ejection of structural steel? Let's take a look.
Now let's look at the collapse of the Twin Towers. We are seeing explosions rather than implosions, a first in demolition history. A sequenced rumble becomes a roar as debris is thrown outward. The damage is not contained. Windows are blown from neighborhood buildings. What kind of energy enabled this? Would fire hurl metal and concrete sideways into the air? Here, a chunk of steel was flung 400 feet, wedging itself deep into 3 World Financial Center on Vesey Street. A FEMA photographer taking pictures of Ground Zero wondered why so many steel beams were jutting from neighborhood buildings. Watt shot pieces of the towers all the way across the street.
In fact, the portions of the tower that had the greatest structural members, the sky lobbies and the mechanical floors, had the perimeter units thrown farther than the perimeter wall units from the upper floors, which theoretically should have, because they're higher, they should have gone farther, right? No, these perimeter units landed on the winter garden 600 feet away. Let's take a look at the physics of this.
Girders weighing several tons were found 600 feet from the base of the North Tower. How fast they were ejected depends on where they originated. If they came from high in the building, they were thrown outward at about 50 miles per hour. If they came from lower down, the speed had to be even greater. Gravity alone cannot account for such high lateral ejection speeds.
In fact, let's take a look at a couple of these specific ejections.
Using special software, we can analyze motion on video clips frame by frame. I have placed markers on each frame so we can track a particular projectile. From the markers, we can get a data table and plot various graphs. The data here shows that the object we were tracking was shot horizontally at over 70 miles per hour. The energy needed to hurl a 4-ton girder at this speed is comparable to the energy needed to hurl a 200-pound cannonball 3 miles.
What about those floors, those pancakes? This is a pancake collapse. We're looking for some pancakes down below. This is a 7-story lobby. There's about 2 or 3 stories of stuff in there. We'll take a look at that stuff, but what I'm looking for is 110 floors with this kind of metal decking underneath 4 and 5 inches thick of concrete. An acre in size, each of them. 110 acres of these. How many floors do we find down at the bottom? Not 50? Not 10? Not even 1. We don't even find metal decking down there, or concrete. There's hardly any macroscopic chunks of concrete. What happened to the metal decking? What happened to the concrete? Tom Patrizio brought these floor decks out. 6,000 of them, he says. I couldn't believe it. Not one floor panel, he notes when he comes back to help the cleanup. Pancakes occur in pancake collapses. Enormous pyroclastic clouds of pulverized concrete? Well, where is all the concrete, in fact? Let's listen to Jeff King.
One of the most significant things to my thinking that indicates that this could not have been the sort of collapse that we are told it was is the presence of the dust clouds. And as you've seen in the pictures, and I'm sure all of us have seen probably more than we would like, there were very, very large clouds of very thick dust that enveloped the area, that crossed the river, that made it almost all the way to New Jersey from the pictures that I've seen. This type of flow is something that we are familiar with in physics. It occurs in only 2 situations that we know of naturally. One is in volcanic eruptions where a large amount of material is suddenly exploded into the air and basically forms small particles.
Thank you, Jeff. How about New York Governor Pataki?
And you look, and you see, and there's no concrete. There's very little concrete. All you see is aluminum and steel.
What happened to the concrete?
The concrete was pulverized, and I was down here Tuesday, and it was like you were on a foreign planet. All of lower Manhattan, not just this site, from river to river, there was dust, powder, 2-3 inches thick. The concrete was just pulverized.
And how about this firefighter?
You have 2 110-story office buildings. You don't find a desk. You don't find a chair. You don't find a telephone, a computer. The biggest piece of a telephone I found was half of the keypad, and it was about this big. The building collapsed to dust.
And this dust made it almost across to New Jersey, across the river. Thick, billowing, laying a carpet of 4 to 6 inches thick around lower Manhattan, pulverized to 100 micron to 10 mil particles, almost like talcum powder, some of it. It's very, very fine. Where's the grinder that produced this? 90,000 tons of it. In these clouds that expanded 10 times the volume of the buildings themselves in just 30 seconds. Now, the available gravitational potential in the whole building is about 110,000 kilowatt hours. That's basically the weight of the building times its height above the ground, evened out. But the expansion of these clouds has been calculated to require about 10 times that energy in heat, which produces that expansion. So we have a problem here. In fact, the gravitational potential of the entire building needs to also produce 4 other heat sinks. But first, we have a 15-story building. This part of the gravitational potential alone, it's converted all of its gravitational potential into kinetic energy. It can't do any more work. In other words, it can't fall at free fall speed and then also crush 80,000 tons of structural steel. It can't fall at free fall speed and also grind up 90,000 tons of concrete. It can't fall at free fall speed and create, by friction or anything else, the several tons of molten metal seen by the first responders. The energy doesn't add up. We're talking overall about 50 times the gravitational potential energy of the building to produce all of this phenomena. How about the victims?
In April 2006, New Yorkers were distressed to learn that bone fragments, human remains from 9/11, had been found on the roof of the nearby Deutsche Bank building.
And how, in God's name, did those fragments get there?
And bone fragments less than a centimeter long. How could they be so small?
700 bone fragments, a half an inch long, found on top of the skyscraper across the street? Think about that one. There were 2,749 victims, but only 300 whole bodies were found. 20,000 pieces of bodies found, 6,000 small enough to fit into a test tube. 1,100 victims completely unaccounted for. In other words, no pieces large enough to gain any DNA from, vaporized. 200 pieces were matched to one single person. Can fire and a gravitational collapse account for this massive pulverization of people? We talked about the iron microspheres. We talked about the chemical evidence of thermate in them and in the slag in the ends of the beams. And we talked about evidence of thermite in and unexploded thermite in the dust itself. All of this is direct evidence of explosive destruction. And none of it can be accounted for by fire. Let's have Dr. David Ray Griffin sum this one up for us.
These facts taken together render the likelihood of the official theory essentially zero. In fact, each of the 10 phenomena, the likelihood of it occurring without explosives being used is by itself essentially zero. But let's be generous and suggest maybe there's a 1% chance that these things could occur. Virtual free fall speed, straight down, enormous amount of dust. 1% chance. But when you figure up the probabilities then, when you say how many, that 2 of them would occur, 3 of them would occur, by the time you get up to 10 of them occurring without explosive, you're talking about the likelihood of 1 in a trillion. So we can say that the official theory about the towers is disproved as thoroughly as any such theory could possibly be, whereas all the evidence can be explained by the alternative theory, according to which the towers were brought down by explosives. The official theory is therefore an outrageous theory, whereas the alternative theory is, from a scientific point of view, the only possible theory.
Thank you. How about that FEMA report? What does Engineering Magazine say about it? FEMA investigation is a half-baked farce, Bill Manning says, that may already have been commandeered by political forces whose primary interest, to put it mildly, lie far afield of full disclosure. The structural damage from the planes and the explosive ignition of jet fuel in themselves were not enough to bring down the towers. How about that NIST report? We got $20 million in 3 years. What happened with our tax dollars? Their task was to determine how and why World Trade Center 1 and 2 collapsed, and how and why World Trade Center 7 collapsed. Let's look at their objective. The focus of the investigation was on the sequence of events from the instant of aircraft impact to the initiation of collapse for each tower. For brevity in this report, this sequence is referred to as the probable collapse sequence. It doesn't actually include the structural behavior of the tower after the conditions for collapse initiation were reached, and collapse became, they say, inevitable. Wait a minute. You're going to spend 3 years and $20 million, and you're going to model every turbine in the airplane, and you're going to stop the entire investigation before the real action begins, right when the point where you're going to stop at the point where the truss was sagging and pulling in the first column, and you're just going to stop your analysis? How many engineers did you have working on this? And what are you concluding? They have 10,000 pages in this report. This is the half page that explains everything after that. No analysis. Let's see their conclusion. The structure below the level of collapse initiation offered minimal resistance to the falling building mass at and above the impact zone. Structural engineers do this every day. This is not rocket science. You have the known weight of this building mass. You have what are known columns below it in order to resist it. You put the building up there and you let it go in your models and you calculate what the resistance is. Why didn't they do it? Could it be because they knew darn well that it would not have collapsed at all? Wait, what was the report title? Final Report on the Collapse of the World Trade Center Twin Towers. Probably should have called it Final Report on the Initiation of Collapse. They also cast doubt on their own theory. They say to us in a letter to our request for correction, which several of us applied for and have yet to see adequate results from, we are unable to provide a full explanation of the total collapse of the Twin Towers. Thank you. We think so too. Prompting Jim Hoffman to write Building a Better Mirage, NIST's 3-year, $20 million cover-up of the crime of the century, in which he documents numerous unfounded assumptions. He documents that it's a mountain of distraction. They'll never read all this stuff. It's a tin rat. 10,000 pages, 1,000 pages modeling the airplanes. And as I mentioned, only half a page on their core presumption. Classic progressive collapse. How can it be classic if it's never before happened in history? As if some initiating element in a steel frame building caused the rest of it to ever collapse. He documents the startling omissions and outrageous lies, which you'll have to go into yourself when you have a little more time, and the fudged computer simulations. They document these unrealistic scenarios, C and D, and the realistic scenarios, A and B. A and B didn't make the building collapse, so they crank up the airplane speed. They reduce the strength of the structure. They increase the fuel. They do all of these adjustments until they get in the more unrealistic scenarios, which they're actually fairly open about, to get the computer model to collapse. Structural engineers rail against NIST because they refuse to show the visualization. It's a black box. You cannot download any of this data. This was a public building, or at least before 3 months prior to 9/11, it was a public building, and it should be a public investigation. Clearly, it was a public event, prompting their former chief of their fire science division, Dr. Quintier, to call for an independent review. Let's look at real alternatives that might have been the cause of the collapse of the World Trade Center Twin Towers. Do we have any whistleblowers? Yes. Kevin Ryan, fired from his job for making public the fact that NIST hired Underwriter Laboratory to perform tests. And these tests showed that the building should have remained standing. In fact, there were 4 mock samples of 35-foot spans, 2 17-foot spans and 2 35-foot spans with fireproofing, just like in the Twin Towers with the floor decking. Now, there's 2,000 degrees of fire put underneath this assembly per ASTM E119, and twice the known amount of load that was known to have been in the Twin Towers. What happens? None of them fail. These are the 4 tests. The steel temperatures were over 1,100 degrees average. Footnote number 3 documents that no failure occurred. In fact, there was only 3 inches of deformation. What does NIST do with this experimental data? They throw it out and they claim that there's a 42-inch sag, 10 times the value that resulted from the experiments. Do we have expert corroboration? Well, here's Van Romero. It's too methodical to be a chance result of airplanes colliding with the structure, this explosive expert says. After the airplanes hit the World Trade Center tower, there were some explosives, in my opinion, inside the buildings that caused the towers to collapse. Van has withdrawn these statements after receiving a sizable grant from the federal government. Mike Taylor, a demolition expert, looked like classic controlled demolition. Collapse of the Twin Towers mirrored the strategy used by demolition experts. How about this structural engineer, Ron Brookman? Explosive clouds of dust and debris moving horizontally and vertically upward as the collapse of World Trade Center 1 and 2 are just beginning does not look anything like a heat-induced gravitational collapse mechanism. Why a complete collapse of the Twin Towers became inevitable? Why would all 110 stories drop straight down to the ground in 10 seconds, pulverizing the contents? None of the official reports address the issue of total collapse. William Rice, structural engineer, also with Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. The prevailing theory would have us believe that each of the Twin Towers inexplicably collapsed upon itself, crushing all 287 massive columns on each floor while maintaining a free fall speed as if the 100,000 or more tons of supporting structural steel framework underneath didn't even exist. How about David Scott, structural engineer with AE 9/11 Truth? Near free fall collapse violates laws of physics. You can memorize that one. How about Scott Granger, fire protection engineer with AE 9/11 Truth? All three collapses were very uniform in nature. Natural collapses due to unplanned events are not uniform. How about Ed Muniak, with us today, fire protection engineer? The fires were very weak, oxygen-starved, as evidenced by the black smoke. Steel temperatures were low. All three World Trade Center collapses have no resemblance to any previous high-rise fire. How about Mathis Levy, who later joined the FEMA team?
If you've seen many of the managed demolitions where they implode a building and they cause it essentially to fall vertically because they cause all of the vertical columns to fail simultaneously. That's exactly what it looked like, and that's what happened.
That's what happened? What happened, Mathis, after you joined the FEMA team? Did you look for controlled demolition with your initial hunch? No. Neither did this gentleman, Ronald Hamburger, who also joined FEMA after saying, "It appeared to me that charges had been placed in the building." Never looked for controlled demolition? How about foreknowledge of these two buildings? FEMA was on site with their exercise tripod too. They had hundreds of people from FEMA, federal government, and the state Office of Emergency Management. They were getting ready for a drill in downtown Manhattan for a biochemical attack. This is per New York Mayor Giuliani. Tom Kenny from FEMA says, "We arrived late on Monday night, went right into action on Tuesday." Coincidence? Maybe. Mayor Rudolph Giuliani.
I went down to the scene and we set up headquarters at 75 Barclay Street, which was right there with the police commissioner, the fire commissioner, the head of emergency management, and we were operating out of there when we were told that the World Trade Center was going to collapse.
Who gave you that warning? Did you warn the firemen and women? We have plenty of video evidence you've seen, and this suggests all the features of a classic controlled demolition with those exceptions which are atypical of classic controlled demolition. None of these features can be accounted for by fire, let alone all 10 of them. We have supporting evidence. This all goes to support the hypothesis of controlled demolition. It's proof beyond a reasonable doubt. If you're with me so far, you have big problems. It's much easier, given our human nature, to go right into paralysis and take no action because the implications of this are absolutely staggering. We come up with these kinds of questions, which are valid. Our government wouldn't do this to us. Well, we're not saying your government did this to you. Somebody was responsible for this. Somebody, somewhere on the inside. We don't know how high up it goes. We don't know how wide it is. I would have heard about it by now. You are hearing about it now. I didn't hear about it until 2 years ago. It couldn't have been kept a secret that long. Well, the Manhattan Project had thousands of people. It was kept quite a secret for a very long time. I'm not an expert in controlled demolition. Wait a minute. Neither am I. But you are the jury, and you have an obligation to make a decision. Guilty or not guilty is typically the decision. In this case, explosive controlled demolition or fire. You have to take this information, process it through your brain, and come up with a decision, and then a course of action. I'm going to help you with the course of action. The decision's a little more difficult. And don't do this. It's too horrible. I don't even want to think about it. I did not even see this stuff tonight, the worst form of denial. You avoid the debate, go back to sleep, and become a part of the problem. And it is a huge problem in America. America is asleep at the wheel. Very few of us know about this. We've got to get motivated with this information and take action based on your response to this rational, scientific, forensic-based information. Work through your fears. Yes, there's fears. If this happened to us, then it could happen again. Then who's in control? Who did I vote for? There are a heck of a lot of questions. We have disbeliefs and mindsets that are contrary to our acceptance of this information. There's no way to get a handle on it for a lot of us. I'm a Reagan Republican. Consider what I had to go through. We got to get informed and inform every other architect and engineer that you can find and everybody else that you know. Support a new investigation. Support these people who demand a new investigation. How about 200 9/11 survivors and family members, 110 military intelligence, law enforcement, and government officials, 170 distinguished professors, 110 entertainment and media professionals, all endorsing a call for a new probe into 9/11. Visit patriotsquestion911.com and look for Andres von Bülow, the former defense minister of Germany, who says this is unthinkable without year-long support from secret apparatuses of the state and industry. How about Francesco Cossiga, who says the disastrous attack was planned and executed by the American CIA? How about Yukisha Fujita, traveling around the world today, prominent senator from Japan, demanding a new investigation? And Paul Hellyer, former Minister of National Defense of Canada. I'd like to see a much tougher, more in-depth inquiry. We have to try to get at the truth. Well, what happened to the truth? Let's take a look at this quote from William Colby. Maybe it can shed some light. The CIA owns everyone of any significance in the major media. That's a heck of a statement from the former director of the CIA. What does it mean? It's documented in many places, including Project Censor, dedicated to bringing all of us the 25 most censored stories from the mainstream media. Why did we not see the truth about 9/11? Well, it appears as if our government lied to us about the building collapses. The 9/11 Commission report reinforced that lie. FEMA and NIST justified it. And the corporate media repeated it, and they hammered it in. We really didn't have much of a chance. Now, we've shown here today that explosives were used to destroy each of the 3 World Trade Center high-rise buildings on 9/11. And it's known that it takes months of planning to set up and engineer and place these explosives. Do we think that Al-Qaeda had access to these highly secure buildings? So unfortunately, this is just the beginning of a disturbing but very essential journey for you back into the nightmare of 9/11. The evidence you've seen tonight is just a small fraction of the vast body of information that the 9/11 Truth Movement has assembled. The questions raised are numerous and ominous that must be answered in a new investigation. I encourage you to discover the evidence that I have not had time to bring to you tonight. It will take thousands, perhaps millions of us. Each one of us, therefore, in this grassroots movement has an ultimate responsibility to take the information that we provided and disseminate it. Get the DVD. Loan it to everybody you know. You must become a truth bearer. Email the ae911truth.org link along with a statement saying, check this out, to every architect and engineer you can find and everybody you know. We will turn heads in the halls of Congress. Check out the other great DVDs, including 9/11 Mysteries, which you've heard several clips from tonight, and some great books by David Ray Griffin, including The New Pearl Harbor and his latest book, 9/11 Contradictions. Check out Loose Change, second edition and final cut. There's some great information available there. And go to journalof911studies.com and Stephen Jones's website, stj911.org. Demand a real investigation. Call and write. Call and write your elected representatives. Write your local television stations, radio stations, newspapers. Call in to talk show hosts. Write to national TV and radio networks. Tell everyone you know. Ask questions, demand answers. Sign the AE911truth.org petition. Sign it demanding a new investigation. Stand up and be counted. There is nothing to fear but fear itself. Everyone can sign, architects, engineers, and all else. We have several categories of people. Millions of people are studying these matters. They're called the 9/11 Truth Movement.
For the average person and for anyone that has looked into this to any degree, there is no shortage of information, evidence that, of course, the buildings were blown up. Why is it that it is so difficult to get people to simply just look?
There is difficulty. I mean, it's not even easy for me as an architect to say, I've been studying this for 2 years. So people aren't open to this. I hear that. Sometimes they are, and it's refreshing. What you need to do is get one of these cards, and we provide it. We got hundreds of architects. We stick our neck out on the line for you. Let them call us conspiracy theorists. All you have to do is say, hey, there's a couple hundred, 400 now, architects and engineers demanding a new investigation. What do you think? You know, you're not saying, hey, I'm a conspiracy theorist. Here's my conspiracy. No. Blame us and ask them, what does this picture look like to you? I'm just curious. 9 times out of 10, they'll say, it's an explosion. It's a mushroom. It's a volcano. It's incredible the responses you get. Support us by becoming a sustaining member. You can make a difference. We are a nonprofit organization that has our hands tied for lack of funds. We need to get the word out to the building professionals. For $10 a month, as little as that, you can become a sustaining member. Architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth are at the apex of the 9/11 Truth movement. Why? Because we have those who have the necessary credibility to raise eyebrows and gain attention. We need to get the vinyl banners, the DVDs, and the brochures into the hands of the real heroes of the 9/11 Truth movement, the people willing to get the message out on the street. We Are Change, Truth Action, Project for a New American Citizen. These folks need your support. We need to act. The power of truth is greater than the power of the lie. So get informed and begin to let the truth speak through you. And get informed through our website. You have all the information you need. Sign the petition here. Follow the red arrows. Become a sustaining member here. It's real easy. Given the numerous warnings of far worse terrorist attacks and war plans against Iran that are in place, we need to do something. Speak out, because a time comes when your silence is betrayal. Thank you so very much for your attention today. Thank you so very much. Thank you so very much.